Thank you guys all for being here today. We're really excited to talk about this topic. So we're going to start off just introducing ourselves. So my name is Dr. Karen Barnes. I'm a psychologist at Seattle Children's Autism Center.
Hi, everybody, and I'm Dr. Jess Peterson. I'm also a clinical psychologist at the Autism Center. I'm excited to see you guys all. And we have one more center here.
Hello, I'm Natashas Lewis Harrington. I'm here as a community partner. I am on the spectrum myself, and I also have my doctorate in clinical psychology, and I'm doing postdoctoral training at UW.
So we're very lucky to have Natasha with us today. So what we're going to be doing is Jess and I are going to be providing a lot of the content today in our presentation. And then we'll have some opportunity for Dr. Harrington to come and share her personal experience. And then at the end, we're going to have about 30 minutes just open for questions, discussion that will be for all three of us. So thank you all for being here in person who are here. Thank you for our sites that I know are participating online and Facebook Live as well. So we're really excited to have everyone here. So start off talking about Julia. So for those of you who don't know, this is Julia. She's a new character on Sesame Street, and Julia is a girl diagnosed with ASD. And this was done intentionally because most media portrayals of individuals with autism tend to be males. So Sesame Street's workshop executive vice president talked about why they developed this character, and they said, "We made sure she was a girl, namely because autism is seen so much more often in boys. We wanted to make it clear that girls can be on the spectrum too. We're trying to eliminate misconceptions, and a lot of people think that only boys have autism." What I also love about Julia is they talk about her strengths. She's a budding artist. She loves to draw. So I think that's great that they highlighted that as well. So our goals today are going to be talking about basically what are the rates between males and females currently in diagnosing autism, how autism may present differently in females with ASD, some specific challenges that might be specific to females with ASD. We want to identify strengths and supports for females with ASD, and then allow some time at the end for questions and discussion. So just starting off just with some background terms, we want to make it really clear when we're talking about gender and sex, that these are two different concepts. So sex is really the biological and anatomical expression, but gender is more socially constructed, right? So there are socially constructed roles, behavior, attributes that society kind of attributes. There's two different parts of gender. There's gender identity, which is one's internal sense of self, and there also can be gender roles, so the behavioral expression of that. And so it's just an important reminder that, we're not thinking of, for everyone, that biological sex necessarily equals gender. Another thing we just want to review is talking about really how we make the diagnosis for autism, because I think this is really important to talk about in terms of how we think about how girls may present differently. So we diagnosed in two main areas. So the first one is social communication challenges or deficits or differences. So one is social emotional reciprocity, so kind of back and forth engagement. The second one is nonverbal communication, so that includes things like eye contact, use of gestures. The third one is relationships, so difficulty developing, maintaining, and understanding social relationships. And also the second category is really more the presence of certain behaviors. And so to meet criteria, you have to meet 2 out of these 4 symptoms. So the first one is repetitive behaviors. The second one is insistence on sameness or rigidity. The third is fixated or intense interests. And the last one is sensory differences. So it could be sensory sensitivities, but also sensory seeking behaviors as well. What's, I think, is a really important addition to the DSM-5, which is kind of our diagnostical statistical manual for diagnosing autism, is that the developers put in this clause, and it says, symptoms must be present in early developmental period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacity, meaning that we might not see these challenges until later in life, maybe adolescence, maybe adulthood, where kind of social demands become more complex. Or they may be masked by learned strategies in later life. And so we'll talk more about this concept, but this may especially be true for girls, for females, who are learning strategies to kind of compensate for some of their challenges. So there's a great book out there called Girls Growing Up on the Autism Spectrum by Shauna Nichols. And in their book, they talk a lot about some common descriptors for girls and women. So the idea that girls and women are often underdiagnosed. It sometimes takes longer to get a diagnosis. Girls tend to fly under the radar, tend to be more shy, so they might not be referred. They seem to have fewer communication deficits. Girls tend to be less aggressive and intrusive. And girl symptoms tend to be more internalized, so anxiety, shyness, which can often be overlooked. So, how do females, come to receive a diagnosis of autism? So there's lots of different paths that may be different than males. So one path we see is that sometimes, like I mentioned before, there might be increased difficulties as social and academic worlds become more complex, and so those challenges become more apparent. A second idea is that there maybe is this missed diagnosis, so meaning that clinicians, providers didn't see ASD for that person, or a misdiagnosis, meaning that they maybe received different diagnoses instead. So we hear a lot about diagnoses such as ADHD, OCD, anxiety, eating disorders being really common in females and they don't receive the diagnosis of ASD until later in life. So, and it could be that there's also these symptoms as well, in addition to the ASD, but I think what happens is some clinicians are only looking through that lens, and they're not thinking about the possibility of ASD as well. Sometimes we see that females maybe have difficulties coping with puberty or just a lack of typical adolescent female interests. And sometimes it happens that maybe there's a sibling or another family member who has a diagnosis of ASD, who receives one. And then it starts to be that, there's maybe similar characteristics or traits in other family members. So now I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Peterson.
Sure. And we're going to start our focus just looking at the differences in rates of autism between males and females, which I think is, makes this subject a great area of interest because there is differences in the rates. And we're going to look at that a little more closely and kind of examine how that falls out. So most folks, or many folks, have heard of the current kind of updates in terms of the prevalence of autism in the United States. So the Center of Disease Control, the current kind of estimates of how common it is. It's 1 in 59 children in the United States have a diagnosis of autism or ASD, and that's updated as of 2014. So clearly it's a big significance to a lot of folks. And when we look at that prevalence, 1 in 59, we look at that by gender or sex, we see it's much more common in males, just in terms of the data that we're seeing. There's 4 males diagnosed with autism for every female diagnosed with autism. So that's a pretty significant difference there. And we even know, so it's 4 to 1 right now, but that gap has closed even a little bit just in the last couple years. And that's due to kind of a relative increase in the prevalence of ASD in females since about 2012. So they're coming a little bit closer, but there's still a pretty significant gap there. All right, and if we break that larger number, so 1 in 59 kids, right, if we break it down by gender or sex, we see that that turns into 1 in 38 males and 1 in 167 females. So I think that difference becomes kind of even more striking there. But we don't really understand why this is the case, why there's this supposed kind of male bias that we're seeing across, at least within the United States and other countries here. So we're trying to understand there's probably a lot of factors that come into play, and we're going to be discussing a lot of those today. But it leads to a lot of questions in terms of, why do more males have autism, at least from what we've collected in terms of the studies. Is there, why do less females get the diagnosis? And is there a true kind of difference in susceptibility? Are males more susceptible to this diagnosis or this condition? So we will be exploring that today. All right. And major organizations like the National Institute of Health, so the NIH, are starting to kind of be interested in this topic as well. They're starting to highlight it. They're starting to ask questions kind of in the public and in the research community about what's kind of underlying this difference in diagnostic rates by sex. Are there females that are passing under the radar? Is there an under diagnosis of females going on? And I will switch back over to Karen, who will talk about that a little more.
So yeah, these questions of why are these maybe females not being identified, right? So one idea proposed out there is that, maybe we're seeing more media portrayals of males, right? And that's kind of start to be part of our prototype and what we have as clinicians or as parents or as, people in society in general have as our idea of what autism is. So, for instance, we hear about Rain Man. There's a boy on Parenthood who has a diagnosis. Recently, Netflix has a show called Atypical. And although not stated, the idea is Sheldon from Big Bang Theory likely is also on the spectrum. So I think, we have to think about how this may influence our own idea of what autism is. And does this, start to become what we think is the only example? And, then we have to ask the question, are people in general just more biased towards more of this, classic, more what would be a male prototype, right? So not saying that only males are diagnosed, but this is kind of what was first identified and described in primarily males. And really either sex or gender could be present with this, but, the idea is that, maybe we're missing some of these girls if they don't fit into this certain prototype that we have in our minds. And so there's been a theory out there. Tony Atwood has done a lot of research on females with ASD, and there's lots of recent research that we'll start to highlight that looks at differences that how females may present. And so there's a hypothesis out there called the social camouflage hypothesis. And it's the idea that females with ASD may develop social skills and coping mechanisms that allow them to blend in or camouflage themselves into society. So it may be that girls, look to other female, girls in society and kind of look to see how they're interacting and kind of develop these internal scripts of ways to interact socially with other people. So one example of this was an example saying that one 6-year-old girl I met several years ago seemed at first to have good social skills. She responded appropriately when I introduced myself, complimented my outfit, and politely answered all of my questions. It was only when I saw her again a few days later after I understood her family's concerns. She made nearly identical overtures as if our interaction were part of a play she had rehearsed. So I think this is an example of we only see kids or teens once, we might not really capture the big picture. And this is why it's so important to get other reports of functioning like, parent report or teacher report. Another way that females may present differently is that, we actually classically hear sometimes that people on the spectrum maybe don't have strong imaginative play. And we actually see that females tend to report, their parents tend to report that they actually have really strong, sometimes, imaginative play or imagination. But what may be different is that maybe their imaginary play tends to be more rigid, or it has to be set up the same way, or it tends to be more scriptive, and so it's not as flexible. And so there's also this idea of masking symptoms, which I talked about a little bit when we talked about the DSM-5 and the new criteria they talked about. So it may be that girls may behave very differently in schools and suffer social confusion and isolation on the playground, but may appear quite differently at home, so the opposite of a cooperative and compliant. They're more likely to melt down at home where it's safe. So we kind of hear this from families where, individuals themselves where they're trying to keep it together and hold it together during the day and kind of come home and kind of able to let it all out. And so there was a mom who talked about, much of this rings true for my 10-year-old daughter with ASD, particularly masking her symptoms at school, and when out socially, being polite and giving eye contact. And, remember from the DSM-5, one of the criteria is fixated or restricted interests. So in general, clinical observations and reports from parents suggest that both males and females have restricted and repetitive behaviors. However, for males, sometimes they tend to be more kind of what classically people think about, like vacuums or train schedules, whereas girls may have similar interest as other females, but they just tend to be more intense. So examples we hear about a lot are, animals like horses or cats, sometimes pop stars like Taylor Swift here. Art tends to be a really big interest, or fantasy or kind of sci-fi. That tends to be another area. And so really when you're asking these questions, you have to dig a little bit deeper and think about, okay, a clinician might hear like, oh, they like horses, other girls like horses too. But how impairing is it from them to talk about other topics of interest? Or do they only want to talk about horses or only play, with horses? So I'm going to hand it back over to Dr. Pierce.
So one thing we thought was important to highlight or kind of ask ourselves and ask of you guys too is this even appropriate what we're doing, right? Should females with autism be compared to males with autism? There's sort of this belief, right, that among folks on the autism spectrum, that males and females aren't different, right? Kind of how they behave, how they are emotionally in terms of their kind of intellectual functioning or capacity. But do we actually believe that for males and females kind of in the wider population? And we wanted to highlight that generally the answer is no. We know there's a lot of differences between people in terms of gender and sex, right? Large-scale studies with the general population that have found that females demonstrate kind of on average more advanced skills kind of interpersonally, emotionally in terms of their social skills. So they might, on average, show more advanced, face and emotion recognition skills, knowing when others are in distress or need comfort, kind of pro-social behaviors like comforting. They might also show an advantage in terms of perspective taking compared to males. So these are important differences for us to recognize, and you can see how a lot of these it's not that males don't develop these, but on average, females might have somewhat of an advantage. And you can see how a lot of these characteristics are kind of symptoms of autism, or at least challenges that are listed as part of what autism looks like a lot of the times. So if we think that in general there's differences by sex or gender, that's probably going to influence the expression of autism symptoms according to gender and sex, things like that. So it's just important to keep in mind. The other important point we wanted to make was that, this difference in diagnostic rates by male versus female is seen in other conditions and other concerns. So things like intellectual disability and ADHD and disruptive behaviors have been found to be more common in males than females. There's a higher proportion of males diagnosed with these conditions than females. Same with what we call internalizing disorders, so things like anxiety and depression. From large-scale epidemiological studies, we see that females are at higher risk for these conditions over the lifetime. Females are twice as likely as males over the lifetime to be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And when females reach adolescence, they start to be about almost anywhere from 1 to 3 times as likely to be diagnosed with some type of depressive disorder as their male counterparts. So it's not just autism that we're seeing this discrepancy. All right, and at this point, we would love to bring up Natasha here. She's going to make some comments about her own experiences.
So I have experienced some of these diagnostic difficulties that they're talking about. My diagnostic journey ended up being kind of circuitous. So I was, in some of the ways, I was a lot like what they talk about with the typically developed, or the typical autistic girls. Like I was very imaginative, but it was really scripted. I had my interests that were celebrities, animals, cats, wolves, those kinds of things, and I was, the shy and cooperative girl. And on the other hand, I was different in a lot of ways. I don't think I did a lot of the masking when I was young. I remember having a lot of difficulty. I was very focused on my interests, and it was well into, I think, high school before I started kind of learning to dial that back and to understand what people expected of me. So I'm not entirely sure why I wasn't diagnosed as a young child. My mom, I remember, had I think it was the Tony Atwood book. She had all the dog-eared pages that sounded just like me, but I think maybe the awareness just wasn't there when I was a kid. And then by the time I got into high school, I was starting to get a handle on some of these things, and so I actually did ask my psychiatrist when I was in high school. I said, do you think I have Asperger's syndrome? That's what it was at the time, and she just totally laughed the idea off. She didn't look into it. She didn't even give me a reason for why she didn't think that was the case, but yes, I just didn't seem autistic to her, and so that, she laughed at me basically, and I was so horrified that I didn't bring it up again for years and years. And then I went into college, and I really struggled with making friends. I got kind of the typical package of misdiagnoses. I was diagnosed with ADHD, OCD, anxiety, depression, social anxiety, and then I started to figure things out. I did a ton of reading. I got really interested in psychology and sociology and those kinds of things. And I just did a ton of reading to figure out how people thought, what people wanted, and so on. And, eventually I got to grad school and I was doing well. I got married. I had, I was doing well in school. I was doing well, for the most part, doing well in the workplace. And so I looked back and I thought, oh, well, I guess, maybe it wasn't autism. I guess it looked like autism, but I outgrew it, so. And then, actually, I think I was about 27 or 28, and one of my friends got diagnosed, one of my female friends got diagnosed with autism. So I started learning about how autism looks in women, and, I realized that I really needed to look into this, and once I started really looking into it, it became clear how many things were still present that I'd managed to kind of gloss over. So I thought, oh, I make friends well, but I was only making friends with men, or I was only making friends through, playing magic cards. I was just avoiding kind of the free-form socializing that's typically expected of women, or I was doing well in school, but I was still upsetting my professors all the time by correcting them. That was my thing. And so my first evaluation was pretty much exactly what they're talking about with people, not taking it seriously in women because we look so different. So it's just like a laundry list of the reasons she said. There were some things like executive functioning, that's a whole other thing, but she was saying, oh, you have a sense of humor, you laugh at neurotypical stuff, you have empathy, you can take other people's perspectives, and, I'm looking at it, I was like, I have a doctorate in psychology, I spent 4 years learning how to take perspectives, but she just totally blew the idea off. And so I went back and I'm, stressing about it. And fortunately, I have friends who know a lot and they're like, get reevaluated. And I went to my psychiatrist, she says, get reevaluated. And I went to go see someone else. And this time I said, are you experienced at, looking at autism in high-achieving women? And this person was. And so she did the testing, and I was finally officially diagnosed at, I think it was 28 years old after, almost a decade of being involved with the autism community as an ally. We finally figured out, there's a reason that I'd been fitting in so well. So, yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of the difficulties that they describe.
Thank you so much for sharing, Natasha. All right, so now we're gonna, switch gears a little bit with the presentation and focus on what the research findings are in this area, right? So a lot of what we've been talking about so far, the experiences and the descriptions are based on, what we hear from families, clinical experience, even case studies. But for a long time, there hadn't been any research. Nobody was really looking into this or asking these kind of questions in more of a systematic way. But more recently, that has changed, so which is really exciting. And we have some findings to kind of talk about and review and see if the things that people have been talking about are showing themselves to be true when we look at it from a research study perspective. So I'll be going over some of that. And really, there's a lot of questions that come up in this area, and females with ASD and what that looks like. And these questions are connected, but they're also kind of distinctly different too. Things like, do females with autism have different characteristics than males with autism? Is that true? Why are males, right, more diagnosed with autism in terms of the rate than females? And is there a difference in susceptibility? Truly, is there a difference in how susceptible folks are based on their gender or sex? And we need to look at these questions in kind of different ways. So there's still a lot to work to do and a lot to learn. But an important point that we like to make when we're kind of opening this box of the research in terms of females and ASD is to point out that there historically, long-term, has been a very significant male bias in the research. So a lot of what we know about autism in terms of genetics and brain development and symptoms is based on research that primarily included males to kind of the detriment of females, right? Females were often excluded from research samples just from sheer lack of ability to kind of identify these folks. So that right there, is a big limitation. The other thing that comes up is there's probably clinical ascertainment bias, and there could be bias in the tools we use to include folks in studies. So we use tools like the ADOS or the ADIR. These are our ways of measuring autism symptoms, and you have to meet a certain score on them. And we use them, right, to include females in studies, but we don't actually know if they're appropriate to be using in the same way with folks across gender and sex. So that could be excluding people from studies who should be included. The other thing is there might be bias in reporting. So teachers, people who are providing information to us in forms of data might be biased in how they report. They might just naturally have different expectations for males and females and how they should socialize, and that might kind of skew things. Or obscure things more. So we like to keep all those kind of facts in mind as we're thinking about this. We want to first dig deeper into that rate, that, like I said before, the 1 in 167 females versus 1 in 38 males. We found that there is some factors that seem to influence those statistics, those rates. If we look at intellectual functioning. So in folks with intellectual disability, so having more of a significant cognitive impairment, we find that rate actually shrinks to 2 males to 1 female. So that similarity in terms of diagnostic rate becomes much more similar. But if we look at folks without intellectual disability, without kind of major cognitive impairment, the rate varies, but it becomes much larger in terms of the discrepancy, 9 males on average to 1 female. And we know that autism, as we've been speaking about and Natasha shared, are on average kind of diagnosed later than males, specifically in this group who kind of do not have intellectual disability. So a lot of the research I'm going to be chatting about is focused on that 9 to 1 difference. What's going on in there? Is there an underdiagnosis? Is there what is creating that discrepancy? And does it truly exist, or are we missing some girls? The other thing that comes up is we know that females are diagnosed later, regardless of kind of having the same age of first concerns or how many times they go to see a doctor about this. So even though a female, without intellectual disability might go to the doctor the same amount of times with her parents who are expressing concerns as a male in the same situation, that female is still, for whatever reason, on average diagnosed later. And females kind of without intellectual disability or without kind of major behavior problems research has shown are less likely to receive a diagnosis. They're less likely to meet criteria based on, a clinician's judgment, even if they have kind of similar level of traits. And that could be for a lot of reasons. Maybe some of it might be those masking qualities or kind of adapting in a way that leads to less, problems from a clinician's perspective, but it's definitely worth digging into and understanding better. So the next area I'll talk about in terms of research findings are whether or not there is actually differences in symptoms for males and females with ASD. And first we're going to talk about the core symptoms. So this brings us back to that picture that Dr. Barnes showed in the beginning with the two bubbles, right? One area being social communication and one area being restricted and repetitive behaviors. And we do see some differences that are arising between males and females in our larger studies. We see that males on average are showing kind of more repetitive sensory or motor behaviors. So some of these motor behaviors that we see in autism are things like hand flapping or repetitive spinning or more complex mannerisms. Seems to occur more in males with a diagnosis of autism, kind of as a generalization. There seems to be more restricted or focused interests, and they're often on things like video games or technology, other more kind of, often typical interests in terms of gender stereotypes. And in general, just restricted and repetitive behaviors have been found to be higher, more symptoms in that area for males as compared to females. So on the other side, you'll see, again, fewer repetitive motor behaviors have been found in this female group. There's also differences in the types of interests that you might see in this group, which I'll talk about a little more in a second. And for some folks, there's also some indications that nonverbal communication might be, and conversation skills might be improved for females. So some of the, people have been saying this, that females might have, better eye contact, better conversation skills, and some of this is showing up in the research that's been done when they've looked at it closely. The other thing that researchers have done more recently is thinking about, the diagnostic criteria for autism. Again, those two bubbles that we showed you. Are there differences in how individuals meet? So folks, to have a diagnosis of autism, have to have, as Dr. Barnes mentioned, symptoms in all of these areas. But there's a lot of different symptoms that go into each of those areas, so it can look really different for different people. So researchers wanted to know, is that true for males and females? And they were looking, again, at that kind of the sample without intellectual disability, so where you have that 9-to-1 discrepancy there. And they did find that there are differences in how males and females kind of met criteria. And the first one, again, kind of as expected, is there were better expressive behaviors like sharing of interests, imagination skills looked improved, even adjusting behavior to fit the social context, so kind of picking up on how you should act in different social situations seemed to be a skill that more of these females with ASD diagnoses had. In the second category there, nonverbal, again, better kind of integration of nonverbal, so talking while using eye contact and using gestures. This seemed to be an area that was kind of resilient in females. However, it did appear that females and males in this group had a similar level of difficulty in terms of reading other people's nonverbals. So their facial expressions, their gestures, things like that. That was a similar kind of challenge, even between the genders or sexes. And then in this last category, relationships, there were some qualitative differences kind of in the challenges. So for females, it was looking like, they could initiate, they could create friendships, but they had a much harder time keeping those friendships going. They tended to be kind of overlooked or ignored by peers versus like rejected by peers. So males in this study in particular were more likely to be rejected and less likely to have, success starting friendships. And then lastly, just overall, the girls were reporting kind of better quality of friendships. Their parents were also reporting a better quality than the males in this group. And And one other interesting thing I'll point out about this study that the authors highlighted, this was Hiller and colleagues, a recent study, was that for a lot of these characteristics, these symptoms that we see, like sharing interests and conversation skills, a lot of the, on average, the females were often, the difficulties were endorsed as somewhat, so challenges occurring some of the time, versus, more common or kind of all of the time they were struggling with these things. So the level of challenge was maybe not as high as you might expect for a person with ASD. The other piece was they looked at how clinicians who diagnosed these females described them. And they found that the description was a lot more ambiguous in terms of symptoms. Sometimes they struggle with this, sometimes they don't. Here's all these skills that are intact, things like that. So they discussed how you could imagine those folks were really highly trained in diagnosing autism, and it was still kind of an ambiguous situation. Imagine folks in the community, if a parent has concerns, talks to their primary doctor, or things like that. You can imagine it could be really difficult for those girls to get kind of picked up. All right, and then the other side of the bubble, the places where girls were meeting criteria in a different way, kind of on average, is in these restricted and repetitive behaviors. And again, we kind of talked about it anecdotally, but they showed to have less kind of restrictive repetitive behaviors, RRBs as we call them overall. And they had different types of RRBs. Just as Dr. Barnes was mentioning, they had obsessions about things like shells and stickers, tended to collect more items, kind of hoarding items, or kind of putting things together. That was more of the repetitive behaviors they were doing. And when it came to repetitive play, with males, we often think about things like flicking the wheels of a car, or lining things up, or driving a car back and forth. With females, it showed in different ways. It was this kind of repetitive play schemes a lot of the time. So maybe it's a family going out to dinner, and it looks really great and imaginative to maybe somebody who sees the play the first time, but then you notice they're doing it over and over and over again, and that's kind of all they're doing. Kind of similar to the story we discussed earlier of having scripts or routines. And the last two areas I'll talk about are studies that looked at how kids present in social settings, like playgrounds and things like that, in terms of differences between males and females with autism. And researchers actually at Seattle Children's, and also colleagues at UCLA did a study where they did just that. They looked at how younger boys and girls with autism diagnoses, how they presented on the playground. And they found that there were some, pretty significant differences overall in what they saw, and that was for the boys, they often saw, it was very obvious that they were having challenges. They were off on their own, they were doing their own thing, they were on the perimeter of the playground, off by a tree. It was clear that they were struggling. Whereas a lot of the girls in the study with autism were able to kind of look like they were making it happen, like they were fitting in. They tended to be around other girls, or flitting between groups of other girls. But when you look closer, they really weren't making those meaningful connections that the other girls were making. It was kind of on more of this superficial level. And the other point is that, for boys, typically, a lot of times at younger ages, it's sports and roughhouse, and for girls, it's more conversation and kind of discussion. And the girls seemed to be more motivated, but they were having a hard time kind of keeping up with that kind of play and being accepted. There's also evidence, kind of growing body of research, showing that girls with ASD present differently than boys at school. So we talked a little bit about this earlier today, kind of through parent stories, histories, that girls might be able to kind of hold it together. Teachers might see less challenges at school for girls with autism versus their male students with autism. And the research does show that, on average, teachers are rating boys with autism as having more problems overall than girls with autism in their classrooms. They rate girls as having lower social problems than clinicians would. So psychologists who might see they're noticing their challenges less. And we also know that female sex or female gender predicts timing of teacher concern. So typically for girls without intellectual disability, it's later in life. And for a group of girls who are diagnosed later without intellectual disability, there's a higher proportion where no teacher has ever had a concern in this study that I'm citing. So in this kind of later diagnosed group, 25% of these females had never had any teacher concern expressed, whereas that was only the case for 7% of the male group. So clearly there's a difference there in how they were presenting to teachers at school or teachers' perceptions. And then the last area I'll talk about in terms of research findings is looking at these associated features, so other kind of concerns. And the research in this area really mirrors the general population, right? Females with autism are, at increased risk compared to boys for things like anxiety and depression. And also interpersonal, there's a kind of a higher rate of at least expressed kind of interpersonal problems in terms of relational aggression, like social exclusion or gossiping, things like that. Again, probably see more of that in females in any population. And then the males are at increased risk for things like aggression and more disruptive behaviors. But this difference, you could see how this could also affect the diagnostic rate. Boys have behaviors that are in your face, right? And they're challenging, and so the referrals might be coming in more for males than females who might have these more easy to miss kind of symptoms that go along with it. All right, I'm gonna hand it over to Dr. Barnes here.
Okay. So kind of segueing from that, talking about what are the special considerations for females with ASD, right? So we've talked about how they may have this unique presentation, so we have to think about considerations for that. So since we've talked about so much about this kind of difficulty with identification, we included some suggestions, some next steps. So again, this idea that females may not present with that same level of disruptive behavior, and so it's really important to consider that in terms of the referrals we get, or even making a referral if you're a provider. And this idea that signs of impairment in female may manifest more clearly over time, right? So it might be that these females need a reevaluation down the road, and that it might be that, some of these challenges don't emerge until later. So we need to be monitoring that. I think it's really important, like we've highlighted, to really think about when we're evaluating a female, really comparing what we would expect to another female of their same age and cognitive ability. So again, just like we don't expect the same behaviors and social emotional functioning for males and females in general, we also wouldn't expect that for males and females in ASD. So it's really important to compare to females. And there is some data showing that mothers report, parents report, they're noticing those concerns, right? Even though the teachers maybe aren't as much. So like a lot of times, parents and some mothers saying like, there's something different, right? There's something, I'm putting my finger on. It might be they're thinking about compared to other females their age. And it's really important to think about, like, even if it's these subtle difficulties, that can still have a tremendous impact on a person's life. And that really warrants more evaluation and support. So that's important to consider. And that it might be that as we move forward, the research is young, kind of even the clinical evaluation processes for this are not there yet, but we want to think about considering female-specific measures, right, or ways to compare to other females to determine screening, diagnostic, and even treatment. So obviously every young woman's going to have their own experience of going through adolescence, but there's, no two girls are the same, but there's some common characteristics associated with ASD that can present with challenges during adolescence. So one of the things we hear about is puberty and hygiene and grooming. So, when you think about this time, it's a tumultuous time in general, and there's a lot of change, right? And going back to this criteria about ASD, change can be difficult for some people on the spectrum. So there's a lot of novelty and change during this time. Thinking about puberty and hygiene and grooming, there's lots of sensory challenges that can overlap with those difficulties. Difficulties regulating emotions, communicating feelings during that time, and just this idea that sometimes there's this delayed social maturity can all impact these factors. So I think, clinicians and parents and people working with people on the spectrum need to be really thinking about these areas, and that females may need more support during this time. There's some great books out there. We highlighted those here. There's this book called The Carer and Keeping You, the body book for girls. Girls growing up on the autism spectrum has like whole chapters diagnosed, relevant to this topic. And there's some good books out there by self-advocates who themselves identify as having autism spectrum disorder. So one is Asperger Girls, and I love this title, just empowering females with Asperger syndrome, right? So thinking about from personal anecdotes, ways that they feel like could be support during these times. As we've kind of already highlighted, same-sex friendships, especially female relationships, are often sometimes difficult to navigate for any female, right? And especially, I think, for someone on the autism spectrum, where there's a lot of these more subtle nuances, and especially as girls go into middle school, high school, like Dr. Peterson mentioned, it's more focused on conversation. So it's not just running around on the playground or playing with toys. It's really expected that you have a deeper level of connection and sharing of emotions and feelings and asking social follow-up questions of the other person. And so that can sometimes impact females on the spectrum. And we know that females tend to be prone to more of the mean girl behaviors, right? Victims of bullying due to their uniqueness, often being socially excluded, or that relational aggression, gossiping, exclusion. So thinking about supports for those females, right, and how to help them navigate that really complex social world is really important to consider. Social media, that's a whole topic into itself, right? For every parent navigating this challenging world with their teen. But there's a lot of texting, phone calls, Facebook, Snapchat, social media, right? And so girls with ASD may need more explicit teaching on how to use media and how to communicate. So there's often these implicit rules that make it difficult. So we might need to think about providing specific social skill support addressing these topics. And again, this is a whole nother topic that can be a whole Autism 200 series, but the idea of this gender identity. So there's increasing evidence that gender nonconforming and transgender rates may be increased in ASD. And so there's, among individuals with gender dysphoria receiving clinical services, there's increasing evidence of a higher prevalence rate of ASD compared to the general population. And so there's these guidelines that have been put out related to ASD and gender dysphoria. And kind of the idea is that when you're evaluating for one, you should also evaluate for the other, right, and consider that. And just understand also that there is more of this gender diversity and that people may be identifying in different ways. It's important to think also about just as girls and females get older, more intimate, relationships and sexuality. So really, again, providing specific skills about this. There's a great book called Safety Skills for Asperger Women, and that was also written by a self-advocate. And so defining, what are appropriate boundaries, modeling appropriate behavior, and thinking about safety issues, especially for individuals who may be more socially naive, more trusting. We have to really think about that and prepare, our females to manage that. This is a great website, Autism Risk Management. It talks about a lot about safety issues. And then just as females, get older, if they're kind of college bound, thinking about, kind of more independent living skills, personal care, self-advocacy, and, thinking about social relationships, how, to relate to other peers, teachers, professors, kind of dorm life. That's challenging for anyone, right? But they may need more explicit instruction support during that time. And just, hearing from females with ASD, there's some other just common themes that they talk about in terms of their experience. So maybe this idea that there's these, societal, cultural expectations for females and kind of managing that. Struggles with their identity or self-esteem, sometimes just fears related to growing up. Some females identify just being more hypersensitive. And, like we talked about, just sometimes it's really, great intense interest and connection with animals, which we just see kind of this characteristic, right, that we often see sometimes in females. It's a generality, but, we definitely see it clinically too. So I think just to highlight, it's really important to also build on strengths for females. So Temple Grandin, who's a famous woman with ASD, says we have to work with our strengths, not our deficits. And that common special interests are the most important social tool and basis for social contact with other women with ASD. So really helping females identify groups, clubs, volunteer work, that's related to their interests, topics of special interest like their, maybe, art or music or science, whatever their gifts may be, is really highlighting those and building on those. Self-advocacy, so really, helping women, self-determination really allows women with ASD to advocate their own needs. And so identifying those strengths and challenges, there's some great online resources. So an active online presence, so there's Autism Women's Network, there's Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I'm sure there's others out there. We'd love to hear about them. And the idea that, if girls and women with ASD are empowered with self-determination and advocacy skills, we often see higher rates of employment and higher wage after graduation. So there's a research study actually showing that. So I think it's just even more evidence that we need to really support females. And so this is just a slide, identifying some women who share their experience, and all women who share their experience are really providing really invaluable insight to the community. So we really appreciate that. So kind of some take-home messages here. This comes from a quote from a woman who is also self-identified as ASD, and she says, "Underdiagnosing of women with ASD contributes to the marginalization of females. If we do not appropriately identify girls in an early age, women will continue to stay in the background and live in seclusion. They will continue to live in isolation." So obviously something to really think about and to, as clinicians, as parents, as providers, as, to think about, are we under-diagnosing these females and not giving them appropriate support? So it's important to really support and embrace uniqueness of females. We want to, part of our goal was just to increase awareness of how females may present differently. And it's not just about getting the label, but it's also about getting appropriate services and appropriate educational supports. So I think that's important to consider. There's a great resource here. It's online. It's from the Child Study Center. They have a whole kind of special service devoted to women on the spectrum, and they have a whole list of book resources here. So a lot of the ones that we talked about today are in this list. And so, what do you do if you have concerns maybe about your daughter or yourself or a family member? So refer to an ASD evaluation, talk to your primary care provider. And then, sometimes there are waits, unfortunately, but identifying the primary obstacles and finding those appropriate supports while waiting for the evaluation. So it might be speech or communication, or it might be social skills or other mental health concerns, and really addressing those. And then we just put up here just some local girls groups that we know about that are kind of focused on, girls-specific social skills. Because that's something we hear a lot about, is that, families often ask, like, oh, are there other females in the group? Because, again, like we know, there's sometimes different needs and different unique supports for those. So I think we will end our content there. And so we're going to open up to questions. What's going to happen is all three of us are going to sit at the table. First going to open it up to the people here in the room for questions, and then I think we'll open it up to our other people watching online. So thank you so much.
I feel like she sees his lifestyle, that it's been challenging for him, and we've done our very best to make sure that she is aware of autism spectrum disorder. And I greatly appreciate you guys doing this today for us. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you.
You're welcome. Yeah, so we were, the question or the comment was about having a child who, with suspected or has gone through an evaluation for autism, didn't get a diagnosis, but seems to have some of the characteristics that you often see in females with ASD. Some of the, maybe some of the more scripted behaviors, or some of the things that come off as really socially skilled, when really there's challenges underneath there. Right, and we were actually just having this conversation. I don't know if Natasha wants to comment on this, because you brought this up earlier. It'd be great to hear your thoughts if you're.
Yeah, honestly, this is a big concern I have. I have a number of friends who are transgender, gender nonconforming, and suspected of being autistic. And my friends who are kind of conventional, nerdy, white or Asian male, went in and got evaluated and they got their diagnosis like that. Friends who are gender nonconforming got the, oh, you're too social, you're a performer, your facial expressions are good. And so, yeah, I think the current understanding is really not equipped to deal with these issues. And so I was saying one of my big concerns when we talk about, the female phenotype, girl autistics do this, girl autistics do that, is that we might start seeing cases where someone comes in either, assigned male at birth, and, the doctor might go, if it was a girl, I might think it's autism, but they're not, so it's not. And so that's, I'm sorry you're in this difficult situation. I am, it's great to hear that my concerns are like something that I really should be pushing, that this is something to be concerned about. And I will also say a lot of the autistic community is supportive of self-identification. So even if someone doesn't meet the full criteria according to the doctors, the autistic community, a lot of them understand that there are lots of reasons why that might happen, and so are supportive of self-identified autistic people.
Going back to that last slide of like what supports can you still provide to him, right? I know sometimes the diagnosis does open more doors in terms of coverage, and but thinking about other specific social skills groups or a therapist you could find that would work with him developing those specific skills that you kind of see that he's maybe doesn't have yet.
All right, so now we will take some questions that have come in from our Facebook audience. So the first question is from Jen Zona. I'd love to hear about if you guys can speak to a dual diagnosis for a female with Down syndrome and ASD, and if there's anything specific about that you can share.
Okay, so, like we talked about, a lot of the research that we're looking at is in, they're studying girls and women with autism and without intellectual disability. And so I think we just don't have as much information about these dual diagnoses, but there's still, lots of issues that are still relevant. The puberty and hygiene, the sexual health, the safety skills, a lot of that is, going to be very similar.
And then the next question we have is from Jackie. And so Jackie's question is, could you please ask the presenters if you guys can speak to the connection between ODD and ASD with or without an autism diagnosis?
Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Yes, so she is looking if you can speak to the connection between ODD and autism with or without an autism diagnosis.
Sure, yeah. So, I think within, kind of the population with autism, you might see, especially in a generalization with males, right? There is increased kind of co-occurring or increased kind of rate of having challenging behaviors like oppositional defiant problems in that population, kind of increased risk, relative to the general population. So you might see some more of those kind of co-diagnoses. Also around language challenges, communication challenges, being within being a common theme within autism too. You'll see kind of disruptive behaviors and challenging behaviors around difficulties with communication. So some of that might get attributed to being more oppositional, might underlie more communication challenges. And then in terms of, I think too, behavior challenges can be misinterpreted as not autism, right? Can be overlooked as when really what's going on is some challenges socially and maybe sensory-wise or otherwise in terms of repetitive or restrictive behaviors that are resulting in these more severe kind of, disruptive behaviors as a whole. So autism might be kind of overlooked in kids who are having more of these challenges. Anything else you guys want to add?
The idea that a lot of maybe females present with more oppositional defiant behaviors, or at least the diagnosis before they get ASD, and it's kind of that filter, how you're looking at it. Like Dr. Peterson mentioned, like it might be that there's other sensory needs or, other reasons why they may be displaying those behaviors. So again, it's in terms of like the misdiagnosis, we often see a lot of females having the ODD, oppositional defiant disorder diagnosis, sometimes before arriving at the autism diagnosis. And it can also co-occur as well.
Thank you. The next question we have is, do you have any recommendations for good resources for teachers so that they can best support their students in this?
For females specifically, or just generally? We do have some good resources that we can connect with whoever would like that, in terms of like reading materials, recommendations for teachers, educational supports. Nothing specifically for kind of supporting females with ASD, but in general, how teachers can kind of support or structure the classroom or strategies and things like that we're happy to provide for folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so with that, what is the best way to refer the person with the question to you to possibly get those resources? What would you recommend for the best way to proceed for next steps? Are they listed on the Autism Center's website, or how would I connect the person asking to get those?
Sure, if they provide their email, we can send those via
Awesome.
email.
Great, thank you.
My question actually segues pretty well. It's kind of the other side of that coin. Our little one who's been chirping up from the center seat here is diagnosed with ASD. She was diagnosed when she was 3. We were very lucky to get an early diagnosis despite her being very high functioning. My question is, the example that you gave about the playground, where the boys tend to be more openly isolated and the girls tend to appear as though they are having a good interaction. Mm-hmm. My question is, I know that she tends to spend time playing by herself, which she enjoys. Obviously, it's much more low stress to play independently than try and get friends to follow your particular idea. But we were wondering, from the kind of parent side of the teacher question, what can we do, or what should we do, I suppose, to make sure that her special education resources and that her teachers can address what could be limited social skill that is masked by appearing to be, neurotypical social interaction.
Can we take that?
Yeah. Sure. So there's a lot of, I think, ways that we, suggest for families that schools and teachers provide support especially when kids have a autism diagnosis, and they can have something like an individualized education plan and can have certain supports written into that. Obviously one of the primary ones being direct support and social communication. So that might look like things like for older kids, or maybe even some younger kids, having available social skills groups, things like that. And not only that, but having someone like a para or a special educator be a part of that group, and then being able to help in situations that are unstructured, like recess or lunch or things like that. Provide that kind of in vivo or in live action support to kind of help facilitate those skills. So asking for those types of supports from your school and from your educators and things like that is something that we think can be really helpful.
So I've always benefited, to this day, I still benefit from really structured social activities. And I think there's a big, people want to see kids doing typical things. And so they just want to say, oh, let's get them good at unstructured social activities. And I've gotten pretty far in my life, and I've honestly benefited from trying to dodge it, I guess, more than trying to fix it, because I did these social activities. I was a big gamer. I mean, she's a little young, but maybe like if there's clubs, activities that they can do at lunch, and then that helped me build up the relationship, getting to know an individual person before I'm able to move on to an unstructured thing. And so I would really encourage, giving her opportunities to practice the skills in an environment that, plays to her strengths in order to develop those friendships.
Yeah, and along with that, just kind of finding like peers that would be, receptive, kind of peer models, right? Peer mentors. So finding like a smaller, so she might be overwhelmed by the large playground, and it might be sensory overwhelming for her, right? And so thinking about like, oh, maybe they have an indoor activity that's a strength of something she likes, to do, and she gets to invite one or two other friends, that are, and it becomes less overwhelming, right, and more structured.
Yeah, and I will say, I think there's a big push for people to say, oh, get in typically developing peers, that you need good role models and so on. But the thing that has been most helpful for me in developing my social life was successful autistic people, because typically developing people were doing things that I was never going to do or that I didn't want to do. So I think it is autistic to autistic friendships, I think, are really underappreciated and undervalued.
That's absolutely exceptional to hear. We definitely wanted to make sure that we weren't kind of putting a very neurotypical and typically developing kind of pathway there. So hearing that it is okay and even preferable for her to practice her social skills and her interest groups, and then expand from there is really good to hear. And it's been excellent to hear from you as well as a successful woman with ASD, to kind of get a sneak peek at what potential she has to grow into.
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about actually is once I got to college, I was masking pretty well, so I learned all these skills for getting people to like me, and by the middle of my freshman year of college, I had lots of people would go to lunch with me whenever I wanted, lots of people I didn't like any of my friends. And so at the end of the year, I just got sick of it. I just dropped all my existing friendships. I had a boyfriend that I was close with, and it was mostly just the two of us. And then we started getting into the gaming, and I started meeting people that I liked, and so socializing became motivating, and it was just a night and day difference.
And when kids are older, we talk a lot about common interest, right, or building foundations for friendship, right? And that's true no matter what. So finding what her strengths are, finding her areas of interest, and finding other people with the same interests are important.
Microphone's coming your way.
I have two questions. The first question is, does the Carekeeping of You, the body book for girls, does that go over issues like boundaries, like when they're getting in and out of the shower, like if they, let's say they walk out with a towel in front of guests and they don't make that connection that, hey, yes, you are covering up yourself, but this person isn't mom or dad or someone that you should trust to be like that? Right. Are those types of scenarios in that book, or are there other ways to kind of go over boundaries? I mean, with boys and girls, with boundaries and privacy and like going to the bathroom and making sure that you're private and stuff like that?
A lot of those books do address it. I haven't read that one recently, so I'm not sure specific about that. But the idea is that, you make a lot of rules, right? And kind of, and sometimes with, people on the spectrum, the insistence on sameness or wanting rules can be really helpful, right? In terms of thinking about, okay, this is the rule here. And so sometimes just laying that out and practicing and role playing with what things can be role played. So that, she can use that in, other situations. Anything to add to that? I think in a lot of those books, there's a lot about what are social expectations and, what are appropriate behaviors when, different places, and kind of like we teach anyone, right? You can do certain behaviors in certain locations with certain people and not in other ones. And I think people on the autism spectrum might just need a little bit more explicit instruction about that.
Yeah, I do think it covers privacy, kind of issues of personal privacy, right? Which I think would apply in that situation, and when different types of privacy situations. I also can't remember exactly if that book in particular covers that.
there's a lot of like resources out there in general, not just specific to ASD.
Okay. And then my second
Actually,
question.
That book's not.
That one's not
That one
specific to
actually
ASD.
is not specific.
Okay. My second question is, since girls and boys have problems, girls with ASD have problems with making friendships, is there any evidence that shows that they suffer when they don't have these relationships anymore? Like, let's say that parents have to move around a lot, or like even boys with ASD, are there any problems that come with that? Like, are they emotionally affected deeply by that once they do have those friendships, and then all of a sudden that routine of seeing that person is gone?
I mean, it might go back to this idea of like motivation, right? And, you know, even kind of Natasha's point, like maybe she had all these friends, but, you know, did she like them? Was it enjoyable? Right. So, we hear from people that like they just want, you know, maybe one close friend and that's all they want, right? They don't want to have maybe lots of different friends. So I think meeting them where they're at in that regard and kind of thinking about, you know, what stage and what quality friendship they want, and then providing those skills to support them in that could be important. Other ideas? I'm trying to think about other.
If the family's moving around a lot, I do think it's probably going to be tough for kids if they have, you know, it's tough on any kid, they say, to move around. So I think if you have trouble making the new friends, then it is going to be tough. But I mean, I think parents don't generally just uproot their children for no reason. And
You'd be surprised.
And so, you know, in those kinds of cases, you just got to, you know, work with them on resilience and make the best of it. And they, you know, autistic kids can be very resilient.
Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Then we have one more resource actually that came from someone on Facebook, from Jackie. And Jackie just wanted to share with everyone that the American Girl book series has great books that cover boundaries, but it's also important to support personal comfort as well. So she just wanted to share that with everyone. Mm-hmm. Does anyone else in the room have questions tonight?
Can people request evaluators who have more skill in diagnosing girls, or like, how would you kind of make sure your practitioner knows how to evaluate girls?
I can talk about that. Yeah. So right now at Children's, we're doing this team model, and I think one of the ideas behind that is that we have 2 to 3 sets of eyes, like 2 to 3 different practitioners that are working with each family. And so in that way, we're not in our own little bubble, and we're getting to consult with different colleagues and talk about this and saying like, I don't know, I'm not sure, like, what do you think, right? And so, and if we're not sure, we bring families back, right? We bring kids back. And so right now there's not a way, at least at the Autism Center, to say a specific provider, but Dr. Peterson and I actually gave a rounds at our talk, and I think everyone there at Seattle Children's Autism Center is very aware of this idea of females. We all talk about it a lot, actually. And then, yeah, there are providers in the community too who do evaluations, and Natasha, I really talk about like.
And I'll also say, you guys can, you know, say if you agree, but you know, if you are having this difficult time, if it's too subtle or whatever, as they talked about, sometimes it becomes clearer as they get older. So you can also, you know, document your concerns over time and then try again once the picture has become clearer.
And I will say too, I think at the Autism Center at Children's too, right, where part of the issue too is you know, we're really realizing the importance of having you know a lot of time with parents to get information, right, outside of the clinic and outside of what we see, and the importance of that, you know, of listening to parents, listening to their experience, and really hearing that, and working very closely with families to kind of get to the bottom of the question and try to best help. Right, because it can be challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of this idea that we say, you know, females can be tricky to diagnose, kind of for all these reasons, right? And I mean, and that's not specific to females. We definitely get cases where like we're stumped. I don't know. That's, you know, get teacher report or see you back in 3 to 6 months, right after this is maybe calmed down. So, you know, we're all and we're fallible, right? We can make mistakes in terms of our diagnoses, and we might just say like, okay, yeah, come back later. Yes, yeah. We often see later diagnoses about, and the idea was about color, the question was about race and ethnicity and kind of like different rates. And I'm not up to date on like the numbers, but I know that's a later diagnosis.
Yeah,
often.
in terms of like ethnic minorities and things like that, the age of diagnosis on average is like a couple years, you know, I'm not sure what the exact rate is, but it's a couple years later than the non-minority kind of groups. In terms of being seen, right, and getting the evaluation, and it's really unfortunate. And I know there's a big effort to kind of close that gap and reach more families and serve more families who fall into that population that might not be getting kind of underserved or underidentified.
And that idea, just health equity, right, in general, and we definitely see that specific, and we see it in ASD as well, and just access to services and even awareness, and kind of maybe biases, in the community of people looking at things a certain way. So, and we're, definitely at Children's, proud to work here because we have interpreters and we're working with cultural navigators, and so we get to see families from lots of different backgrounds and experiences and cultures, and that's, I love doing that work to be able to serve those populations.
All right, so we have 2 more questions that have come in from Facebook. One is, are there any evidence-based treatments out there that are specific to girls and the specific needs that were discussed?
I wish.
No, yeah, unfortunately, not yet.
Not yet. I'm sure people are working on it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of, setting the stage, right? There's these differences, and next comes like the treatment, right? I think that's kind of in general.
I will say though, there has been groups, especially at Children's, right, devoted to kind of more, girl or female-based issues around things like hygiene or sexual education and things like that, like kind of education, kind of girls groups in the past, and there might be in the future, and there is, probably, these aren't evidence-based, they're not, you haven't been run through research trials or anything, but kind of more geared to support, this kind of specific population. And that might be happening in the community, I'm sure, as well.
But I don't know anything else.
Yeah.
And then we did share the 3 links to the girls groups from the slide deck, so that is in the comments for everyone as well. The next question is, are there access to groups and resources that don't charge, or are there maybe programs available that someone could get assistance, financial assistance, to assist with access?
Yeah. That's well, there's
one that I know. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about it? Yeah.
Ben's Fund.
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking of? We talk to our families a lot about Ben's Fund, which is a program that Washington residents who have kind of a verified diagnosis of autism could be eligible for. They just need kind of a provider letter verification of the diagnosis and kind of support. And it's kind of a financial support grant for up to $1,000 that you can apply for every year. And you have to identify like a specific treatment or therapy piece of equipment, occupational therapy, weighted blanket or something. You have to identify something, but you can apply for that annually.
So I will I will plug, it's not a clinical group, but the Square Pegs meetup group that we have. It's not like social skills, it's not teaching, it's a socializing group for autistic people to be with other autistic people. I've been to a couple of the meetups, I really enjoyed talking to the folks and found that pretty great. I don't know if they have anything to offer to help children, so people could reach out to them and see if they do have anything, but for adults, I really like that as a resource, the Square Pegs meetup group.
Another thought I just had is social skills groups often aren't covered, unfortunately, by insurance sometimes, but speech therapists often are, especially with a diagnosis of autism or a communication disorder. So sometimes what I do is, navigate families to find maybe a speech therapist who has expertise in social skills and can do that in a more like one-on-one environment, or sometimes they might bring in like another kid who's working on those same skills, and they kind of work together to practice those social skills. So that's another avenue that sometimes does then get covered by insurance, but it's not the classic like social skills group. And sometimes they are covered by insurance, but usually I'd say a lot of times out of pocket, unfortunately, right at this moment.
One more we have. So this is from Rachel. And Rachel, I apologize because I just saw your comment. So if you are still watching, Rachel is really hoping, is there any advice for adult females searching for diagnosis?
I mean, that's a very broad question. I guess, again, I'll go back to what I told her, which is, regardless of what the professionals say, if you feel that you belong in the autistic community, you're going to find a lot of people who will welcome you, and they can kind of guide you through the process if it gets difficult, and through finding resources that might be accessible even without a formal diagnosis. So I hope that getting a diagnosis goes smoothly, but you have options if you don't.
So that is all the questions we have from our Facebook audience. Does anyone in the room have any more? Got one? Awesome. Right there with the mic.
This is kind of a specific rather than a general question, but I was interested in the kind of topic of conversation of female and female friendships for girls with ASD. I know that my little one has some trouble sometimes with the nuance of social interactions where she'll play with a female friend one day and they're friends and it's great and they have the same ideas, but then if the next day her friend wants to play with someone else, she has a hard time understanding the distinction between they just want to play with someone else today versus they don't like me. Is there anything that we can do to kind of explain that or give her a better understanding of that nuance of social interaction?
Do you do social stories?
I do not. We do not.
I think those can be a really valuable resource. Do you guys have a resource for how to do
We do.
social stories?
Yeah, we have we have some good links how you can create your own social stories around like a specific topic like that, like friends and.
I think maybe on our autism blog, I think it has a whole topic once on social stories. And
Yeah, to this day, I'll kind of make like little informal social stories for myself, because even though, I have a doctorate and everything, and I have the cognitive ability to grasp these difficult things, just because of the way my brain works, being able to see it and go over it over and over is incredibly helpful. So I really recommend social stories for anybody who's dealing with a variety of challenges.
is it Carol Gray, right?
Yeah, Carol Gray. It's like graysocialstories.com, I think,
Yeah.
is the website.
And she's kind of one of the people who's developed a lot of social stories. And for any of
Yeah.
those who don't know what those are, it's basically just pictures along with stories. It's like going to the dentist, and this is what happens when I go to the dentist. And so there's lots that go around social skills as well, and friendships.
And then with the social skills, you can also do like speech bubbles and thought bubbles. So say like, my friend says, I want to play with someone else, and then show that they're not thinking anything bad.
Mm-hmm. It's the mic.
Do you have one back there? Last question, anyone? One more? Hold on one sec. Let's get you the mic.
Oh, I just also want to say I'm also a therapist, and I feel like this is a really misunderstood area in our field. It'd be really amazing if you all could repeat this for like mental health clinicians and therapists, because I feel like we're under taught in this area.
We'd love to.
And then just a reminder for anyone who wants to share this, the video of this class with anyone or rewatch it, maybe pieces of it, it's available in full as soon as I turn off Facebook Live. When this class ends, anyone can watch the video in full right on Seattle Children's Facebook page immediately. So just wanted to share that there. And then I think that is all for the questions for now. So thank you to our speakers for being here and leading this. We really, really appreciate it. Do you guys have any last words for the class and audience watching?
Yeah, just thanks everybody for your interest and for being here tonight, either in person or live. And I think especially thank you to Natasha for being with us.
Yes.
It's so invaluable to have her here with us tonight and volunteering her time. So it's just really wonderful. Thank you all.